It's Monday, the 8th September 2025. A quick look at some of the headlines making waves in Nigeria today. We begin with the Punch newspaper. The leading story says, NUPENG versus Dangote. Union insists on strike, meets federal government, others today. The complete story can be found on page 21 of the Punch newspaper. And above that story, Accountant General plots to preempt Supreme Court, set to pay Osun LG funds to court sack APC chairman. Councillors, NUG cries out. The complete story can be found on page 9 of the Punch newspaper. And above that story, lending rates may fall as inflation eases, says CBN. The complete story can be found on page 30 of the Punch newspaper. And above the leading story from the right, Natasha to resume Senate after London trip, says lawyer. The complete story can be found on page 14 of the Punch newspaper. Naira strengthens to 1,514 naira per dollar, nears 5 months high. The complete story can be found on page 23 of the Punch newspaper. Leadway Holdings announces acquisition of PAL pensions. The complete story can be found on page 26 of the Punch newspaper. Moving over to Daily Trust. The leading story says, schools resume amid biting economy. The complete story can be found on page 3 and 4 of the Daily Trust. And above that story from the left, gunmen kill 23 in Katsina, Kaduna, Plateau, Kwara, Niger. The complete story can be found on page 6 of the Daily Trust. Daily Trust Board of Economists list strategize to combat poverty. The complete story can be found on page 23 of the Daily Trust. Leadway Holdings announces acquisition of PAL pensions. The complete story can be found on page 33 of the Daily Trust. And below the leading story, how Boko Haram killed 63 in Borno, says survivors. The complete story can be found on page 5 of the Daily Trust. And below that story from the left, workers to federal government, 70,000 naira minimum wage insufficient. The complete story can be found on page 32 of the Daily Trust. Fuel scarcity looms as tanker drivers begin strike today. The complete story can be found on page 7 of the Daily Trust. Federal government threatens X over anti-Tinubu post. Sowore vows resistance. The complete story can be found on page 35 of the Daily Trust. Moving over to Vanguard. The leading story says, Dangote / NUPENG face off. Federal government moves to avert nationwide strike. The complete story can be found on page 5 of the Vanguard. And above that story says, NLC, federal government workers demand minimum wage review. The complete story can be found on page 9 of the Vanguard. And below that story, UN, Atiku, Obi, Ndume rage over killing of 63 in Borno, demand probe. The complete story can be found on page 13 of the Vanguard. DD Microfinance Bank, how it turned deficit to big balance sheet. The complete story can be found on page 15 of the Vanguard. And below the leading story from the right, now in sports, 2026 World Cup qualifier, Osimhen out of South Africa clash. Take 2. 2026 World Cup qualifier, Osimhen out of South African clash. The complete story can be found on page 38 of the Vanguard. LG funds, Osun NUG warns OAGF, CBN over plot to preempt Supreme Court. The complete story can be found on page 10 of the Vanguard. Interest rates, manufacturers look beyond banks for survival. The complete story can be found on page 23 of the Vanguard. Moving over to Nigerian Tribune. The leading story says strike. NUPENG adamant as federal government calls for talks, urges truth. The complete story can be found on page 3 of the Tribune. And above that story, Afremix Bank, BOA seals $1 billion deal to support Nigerian farmers, says SMEs. The complete story can be found on page 6 of the Tribune. Nigeria exempts goods valued at $300 from customs port duty. The complete story can be found on page 6 of the Nigerian Tribune. And below that story from the left, Nigeria in grip of full-blown security emergency, says Obi. The complete story can be found on page 5 of the Nigerian Tribune. Atiku decries Borno Boko Haram's killing. The complete story can be found on page 5 of the Nigerian Tribune. In health, we have artificial sweeteners age brain 62% faster. The complete story can be found on page 4 of the Nigerian Tribune. Moving over to the last paper on the list, The Guardian. The leading story says, National Grid faces 5.6 trillion naira revenue loss as premium customers exit. The complete story can be found on page 6 of The Guardian. And above that story from the right, Customs exempt $300 parcel from tax as cargo owners decry duty payment disruption. The complete story can be found on page 4 of The Guardian. Sowore, CSOs push back as DSS asks X to delete anti-Tinubu tweet. The complete story can be found on page 3 of The Guardian. Dangote, NUPENG face off. Federal government urges caution. The complete story can be found on page 3 of The Guardian. And below that story from left, mayhem as thugs invade rally for Obi. Roads Viva in Lagos. The complete story can be found on page 5 of The Guardian. Prominent Nigerians push for electoral reforms ahead of 2027 polls. The complete story can be found on page 29 of The Guardian. And below that story from the right, Army neutralizes 4 terrorists, arrests 64 suspects in nationwide operations. The complete story can be found on page 8 of The Guardian. Parents groan as school resume. Imo outlaws some practices. The complete story can be found on page 29 of The Guardian. Leadway Holdings announces acquisition of power pensions. The complete story can be found on page 18 of The Guardian. Insecurity. Northern leaders demand state of emergency, sack of service chiefs. The complete story can be found on page 6 of The Guardian. And these are the headlines making waves in Nigeria today. If any of these headlines caught your attention, do get a copy of the paper to read the complete story.